A year into his latest leadership term, Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva seeks to reunite his country while managing a G20 presidency. How does he plan to handle both those challenges? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Brazil is beginning 2024 by pausing to contemplate the scope of what happened in its capital 1 year ago. It was January 8th, 2023, when supporters of the defeated former president Jair Bolsonaro stormed government buildings and the presidential palace, calling for a military coup against the new president. Now, Lula is seeking to move a deeply divided country forward. CGTN's Paulo Cabral has this report from Sao Paulo.
Demonstrations have been called in several cities all over Brazil to mark 1 year of the attacks on Brazil's main public buildings in Brasilia, the presidential palace, the Congress building, and also the Supreme Court. These attacks were organized and carried out by supporters of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who did not accept his re-election defeat and wanted a military coup to prevent the winner, President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, from taking office. The protesters here are mostly from left-wing groups and left-wing parties. We see flags of the Workers' Party of President Lula da Silva, of the Communist Party of Brazil, also several trade unions, and we see signs such as these ones that we see here that say prison for Jair Bolsonaro. There was also an event happening in Brasilia bringing together the heads of the main branches of power in Brazil, the executive, the Congress, and the judiciary. And President Lula da Silva was there, and he spoke and he said that punishments are essential at this point, because if they do not happen, this will mean a free pass for what he called other terrorist attacks here in Brazil. Punishments are being handed out. The Office of the General Prosecutor of Brazil has charged almost 1,400 people in connection with the attacks in Brazil, and they are now being tried by the Supreme Court, and some hefty sentences have already been delivered, in some cases more than 17 years in prison. But investigations are still continuing to determine the people who financed the actions and also those who inspired them. And opponents of Jair Bolsonaro hope that the former president himself will be held accountable for what happened in Brasilia. Brazilian authorities and the government have managed to prevent this crisis from escalating further, but there is still much work to do to pacify the country and appease the political tensions that still exist. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, São Paulo.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Maryland, Saurabh Gupta is a Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. From Sao Paulo, we're joined by Gilson Schwartz. He is a Professor of Economics at the University of Sao Paulo. In Beijing, Andy Mok is a Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and Gustavo Ribeiro is the Founder and Editor-in-Chief of the Brazilian Report. Welcome to all of you. Gustavo, it's been a year since President Lula took office, and right now the country is marking the first anniversary of that uprising which took place in the capital. President Lula, in this year in office, has tried to restore order, tried to restore democracy. What is your assessment of his first year in office, or this time round?
Well, I think, first of all, thanks for having me again. I think there's a lot of positive, and there's a lot that could have been done better. I think that the economic data was much better. The economic results were much better than anyone expected. Markets expected GDP growth to be below 1%, and they are probably going to end the year 2023 around 3%. Inflation will end the year within the government's target band. The central bank has the conditions to continue the easing of the monetary policy, and most importantly, the government managed to get a sweeping tax reform off the ground. There's a lot still to be decided by Congress in terms of regulation to decide to determine where the Brazilian VAT tax will be. But this is a reform that has been 30 years in the making, and the government put its political weight behind it and got it done. But there's also many issues with the Lula government in regards to its relationship with Congress, which could have been more better oiled. The government engaged in some agenda points that were dead on arrival, burned political capital at the beginning of the year. But overall, I think the government had good conditions and actually knew how to use those conditions for positive results.
Saurabh Gupta, as Gustavo tells us there, the president has had some successes in his first year in office, but he's got a problem. He faces a very hostile Congress. The majority in Congress comes from the opposition. I mean, the country also faces socio-economic problems. And, you know, across the board, we do hear some commentators say, look, there's been some success, but it's not enough. How do you see it?
You know, President Lula is obviously taking up a complicated political situation back home, especially with the tensions coming from the attempted coup. We shouldn't call it a coup, but I mean a coup by the outgoing leader. So obviously politics is not easy. We've seen in the United States how difficult it is to manage these sort of situations, and particularly in this age of disinformation, how much more complicated it is. But I think President Lula has a real opportunity as G20 host in putting Brazil's stamp, Brazil's mark in the international system. I couldn't think of a better G20 host at this point of time, given where Brazil is poised where it stands with regard to the United States, with regard to China, with regard to the European Union. This is as best an honest broker role as you will find in the international system. And of course, Brazil is a weighty economy and a weighty country. Mm-hmm. So as good a honest broker role that one can find in the international system today, and definitely within the G20. And I think the G20, just as it helped Mr. Modi last year, and shown a spotlight not just on him, but also on his country. President Lula can also use this opportunity to shine the spotlight on Brazil, on the possibilities of what Brazil can do in terms of brokering relations and its own contributions on many of these important themes and topics, given that in the past, over the past 15, 20 years, Brazil has been an exemplar in some ways in terms of how it has gone about reforming itself politically and from a macroeconomic and financial standpoint. It is no longer a poster child where the IMF needs to come. It's one of the best managed economies among the emerging markets in some respects. And so this is an opportunity for Brazil to shine. And I think that is what is going to be Lula's focus this year.
Gilton Schwartz, as we heard, the economy grew by 3%. That was better than forecast. As Gustavo told us a moment ago, there were some who were not expecting a growth rate of much over 1%. But if we look at some of the other achievements of the president in his first year, the minimum wage was increased, and that will combat inflation in the country. Social programs have been resumed, and he maintains the anti-poverty social program, the Bolsa Familia program. What is your view?
Well, I think that the Lula government is innovating. It's not as we saw in his previous mandates. There are a few very interesting innovations in terms of policy, both internally and externally. I would say that the main innovation internally, although it's not as commented, as discussed as it should be, is the new industrialization drive coupled with sustainability targets. So the idea that economic development must be regulated and stimulated by the state, especially by the National Bank for Economic and Social Development, new credit lines, not only social policies, but really targets in terms of industrial policies, science and technology. This is really impressive. And I would stress, even today I was talking to João Brandt, he's the National Secretary for Digital Policies, and there will be in March, by the end of April and the 1st of May, a very important meeting, a summit on digital policies and the digital transformation in Brazil, led by the presidency of Brazil. So these are really innovations, coupling new industrialization with sustainability and a very active role in the governance, the global governance of the digital transformation. That's a subject that interests directly China. These are really very interesting innovations internally. Externally, I think that Brazil has Lula again, but let's remember that Dilma Rousseff, the former president, is now the president of the BRICS Bank. So we are talking about innovations both internally and externally, with a drive towards recovering developing countries, dealing with their debts and dealing with social inequality in the context of development with sustainability. So it's a new discourse, it's a new narrative, and a very important role for the governance of digital transformation on a global scale.
Andy Mok, as we just heard, Brazil under President Lula is playing a growing international role. Brazil, of course, becomes the president of the G20 for this year, and as Gilson Schwartz just told us, the former president, Dilma Rousseff, she is president of the BRICS Bank in Shanghai. How would you characterize the Brazil-China relationship? In fact, President Lula was in China last year.
Indeed. Well, Anand, I think from China's perspective, Brazil as a country, as a member of the global community, is important. Sixth largest in terms of population, or 12th largest in terms of economy. From a bilateral perspective, trade perspective, China's Brazil's largest trade partner, and of course, China looks to Brazil for some very, very important imports, including commodities. And then we look at it more from a regional or a multilateral perspective. So as you mentioned, BRICS, of course, is a very important organization, and Brazil, as a founding member, plays a vital role. I think in this, where we are today at the beginning of 2024, the world faces a number of very challenging economic circumstances, high interest rates that are having a disproportionate effect on the global south, conflicts in different parts of the world that are having a severe economic impact, and I think can be best addressed through a multilateral approach, forum like the G20. So I think from China's perspective, it's been pretty clear and consistent. I think Brazil is an important and valued interlocutor, and that's only going to grow in importance this year because of Brazil's role in these various organizations, but also with Lula as president. So I think it's also important to point out that Brazil's unique politically in that I think it has a visceral understanding of the challenges facing multi-party systems. We heard about some of the parallels with January 6th in the United States, but also, especially with Lula, and Anand, you mentioned the Bolsa Familia, that the values, the outlook, the focus on improving the lives of ordinary people through poverty alleviation, raising the standard of living, the quality of life, healthcare, education, I think align very much with China's view of how governance should be conducted. So I think it's a pivotal year.
Gustavo, as you pointed out, Brazil took over the G20 presidency from India last December. And if we look at the motto or the goals that Brazil has set for itself, Lula has three main goals: reducing poverty, phasing out fossil fuels, and reforming global governance. I mean, those are big tasks. They're big jobs, big challenges. What do you expect this year?
Well, just if I may, it's interesting how Lula, this past 20 years, seems to be at the right moment, at the right time. In his first two terms, with his goal of reducing poverty in Brazil, he benefited largely from the economic circumstances of the time with the commodities boom. And now He's trying to resume this presidential diplomacy that Brazil had in the 90s and with him in the 2000s. The stars have aligned to put Brazil in the global spotlight. By the end of his term in 2026, Brazil will have held the rotating presidencies of the UN Security Council, the Mercosur Trade Alliance, the BRICS group, and now the G20. In terms of his goals, I mean, most of it is pretty consistent with his internal agenda. I would just like to add a caveat on the environmental side of it, because while Lula, especially in the latest COP, he focused largely on Brazil's impressive results in terms of curbing deforestation in the Amazon. His moves regarding the environment have been somewhat inconsistent. He defends moving away from fossil fuels, but his administration at the same time has tapped into any and every oil reserve that Brazil has, including in an area called the Equatorial Margin, which has oil reserves in sensitive environmental areas next to the mouth of the Amazon River. Sectors of his administration have tried to overrule the Environment Ministry, which denied the permit to explore his reserves off the Amazon coast. The man he appointed to head the Petrobras, the state-owned oil firm, said that he wants Petrobras to be the last standing oil firm in the world. So he is talking the talk, but he's not always walking the environmental walk.
Well, Gustavo, as you say, he has not been consistent on the environmental issues, but he's also faced some challenges, hasn't he? I mean, one of the biggest issues for Brazil, in fact, for the world, is deforestation in the Amazon. And he's facing a challenge from Congress now, isn't he? Because Congress has actually weakened local people's rights over their territory in the Amazon.
Absolutely. And as much as he has been inconsistent, there's just so much the government can do. Congress, as you said, is very conservative. It is dominated by rural lobbies as well, and has tried to pass legislation to narrow indigenous land rights, to loosen up regulations on pesticide use, and actually to loosen deforestation rules. There's also the fact that while internationally we focus a lot on the Amazon, deforestation is increasing in other biomes, such as the Caatinga, which is a semi-arid biome, and in the Cerrado, which is a savanna-like biome. And these areas, they have much looser deforestation rules than the Amazon, and many of the states where these biomes are located are ruled by conservative governors that are lenient towards deforesters. So yes, there is the issue that the state governments have a lot of autonomy in regards to certain regulations, and also Congress, which is tilted way to the right, and where the rural lobbies have an oversized power.
Gilson Schwartz, President Lula, he also wants to dismantle inequality, which has been in some ways built into the system there. He wants a minimum global corporate tax of 15% while ramping up investments in renewable energy. The goal is to reduce tax evasion on the one hand, and also to recover lost taxes. Where do you see that going?
Well, I think that we have seen progress along the lines of a tax reform that was in the making for about 30 years. So this is really a very important advance, even with the conservative Congress. And of course, social policies have been resumed. I think that we are still lagging behind in terms of the educational system. There is a consensus that overcoming social inequality requires deep, large, consistent, long-term investments in the educational infrastructure. This is still lagging behind, and that's, I think, dependent on clear definitions with respect to the digital transformation, distance education, the use and spread of technology all over the economy. So this is a very huge structural transformation, the digital transformation, that requires a lot of investment in education. The Ministry of Education is still lagging behind in terms of launching very progressive or intensive investments in the educational reform of the country. That would be really the main road towards reducing social inequality.
Sohrab, Brazil takes over the G20 presidency. I mean, and there's some huge challenges insofar as international security is concerned. We have the two major wars going on right now, which are on our front pages and our television screens. That's the Ukraine conflict, the Israeli onslaught on Gaza as well after those Hamas attacks in October. President Lula has said before that he supports a two-state solution. Will these issues, do you think, be high up on the G20 agenda?
Yes, they will have to be high up on the G20 agenda. It's primarily, G20 is primarily about macroeconomic and financial policy, economic policy, but also social and non-security, non-political issues. But these are such huge issues, they cannot be overlooked. We are fortunate for that because of the New Delhi G20, the Ukraine issue has kind of been dealt with within that framework. In the first year, Russia was called out as an aggressor in the G20 communique, and there were real fears that for the first time a G20 summit would not have a communique, a consensus communique, would have to have a leaders would have to have had a chair statement. But fortunately, I think the Western powers pulled back a little bit, and New Delhi was able to put across a consensus communique, but which did not call out Russia in the strong terms. So I assume that is going to be now the standard going forward. So that is not going to be an obstacle to other G20 business that Brazil will be heading. But of course, in some regards, the Palestine issue needs to be part of the G20. I mean, this is an issue since 1947. The outlines are pretty clear on this. I think just about a month back, there was a vote on whether one supports self-determination for the Palestinian people. I think there were 172 countries which supported it, with just 4 opposing. And so I think the vast consensus is that there must be a way found to not resolve the issue, but at least to stop it. But I'm hoping that that this will not distract, frankly, from the other larger issues which are being faced in the G20. Of course, we're talking poverty, inequality, but also in terms of pushing the ball forward in terms of reform of governance of the international institutions. And I think, again, G20 last year made some progress in terms of, at least from the economic side, trying to buffer up the multilateral development banks, trying to do debt relief for poor countries. There was success last year in this regard. And I think that provides a kind of a platform on which greater achievements can be made this year. And I think that is where the real focus needs to be, on poverty alleviation, on debt relief, on tackling the climate challenge, and incrementally, how do we go about reforming international institutions? And we'll see where this goes. But I think Brazil is best placed, frankly, as a major power and someone in the middle with decent ties with the US and good ties with China, to be able to thread that needle.
Andy Mok, how do you see Brazil use this chairmanship of the G20 this year to push forward the agenda for the global south? And I mean, it will, of course, be working very closely with China on these goals.
No, and I think that really is the central question. So we used the phrase, the stars have aligned earlier. And I think that's quite right, in that when complex entities like countries or groupings of countries want to make significant change, it takes leadership and vision, of course, but it also takes the proper time in terms of when there are structural changes. And I think no one would doubt that we are living through some very, very important structural alignments. So I think for Brazil, for Lula, it's a case of carpe diem, seize the day. That being said, I think from the G20's perspective, it has 2 important roles. So one is firefighting, putting out the fires that are raging in some parts of the world. And here I think of Leon Trotsky's phrase, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. And we see In West Asia, the impact on shipping this is having, of course, this has global economic ramifications. But at the same time, the G20 also needs to build structures that are more fire resistant for the future. So I think one of the challenges for Brazil, for the G20, and China playing a role in this is balancing that, making sure that these fires do not rage out of control. To the degree it can be prevented, military escalation and the related economic fallout from that, at the same time advancing these important initiatives.
Gustavo, there are some expectations on the part of Brazil in the run-up to the G20 summit, which will take place towards the end of the year. Brazil says it will launch an initiative for the bioeconomy, that's the more sustainable use of natural resources, as well as a new initiative on climate change. What do you expect?
Well, I think Brazil has on its side the fact that our electricity matrix is much cleaner than developed nations. But I think also that one thing that could be a negative in terms of leading developed countries is that Lula has never lost an opportunity to point the finger at developed nations and say, it's your fault we are where we are. I'm not saying he is wrong in doing so, but might not be the best way to avoid rubbing countries the wrong way. And also, I think the fact that, as I mentioned, Brazil has been full throttle on the issue of fossil fuels might also undermine this rhetoric of trying to lead the world to a more carbon neutral economy.
Jilton Schwartz, I've only got about 40 seconds, but Foreign Policy had a piece in which it said that Brazil's G20 leadership will test how much global South countries can advance reforms, especially on the issues of global debt and on current lending systems and how they work.
Yes, I think that this is really a unique opportunity. The stars are aligned, as already mentioned. Right. And one important point to stress is Brazilian diversity, ethnic and cultural diversity. That could give us really a new position in terms of leading the world to a more peaceful scenario.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thank you to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.
The nature of business is to bring value. Business activities in Europe, Asia, and the U.S. reach consumers globally. Trade, manufacturing, energy, high-tech, real estate, consumption. We give an expanded view on global business and how it covers, influences, or relates to the whole world. Global Business, only on CGTN.